So, hello everyone. Before we start, we will wait a few minutes for more people to join us today. And I will do a briefly introduction about myself. My name is Yixin, and I'm the fourth year student studying art history and media studies at U of T, and also the founder of Alpha Arts. Alpha Arts committed to help humanities and social science students from academic choices, community activities to background improvement and career planning. And our Alpha Talk series aims to connect art professionals and provide mentorship to current students. During the talk, please feel free to use the Q&A function down below on your screen to ask us any question you may have. And today we have Josh here, who's the curator of education and public programs at the Power Plant Art Gallery. And Josh and I are both in Toronto right now, so good morning, Josh. How are you?
Good morning, Yixin. I am doing well, thank you.
Great. Have you had your morning coffee yet?
It's been brewed. I'll have it after this program.
Sounds good. I'm so excited to see you again, as I know we've met 2 days ago, and I know we've been emailing back and forth for the past 1 month to coordinate this series, Careers in the Arts. So how did you feel when I first reached out to you and told you about this series, like connecting art professionals to the current students?
Yeah, so I mean, I think these sorts of programs are vital. I mean, the arts are a small but powerful sector, as a driver of revenue in many different ways, and I think it's a really creative, obviously, career choice, but it is challenging to navigate, and so I think it's really important as early as possible for anyone who might be considering pursuing a career in the arts to begin networking, to speak with really everyone they possibly can, to learn all different strategies. I'll say my interest in museums, maybe I'm jumping ahead to another question, but my interest in museums was really kickstarted in my mid-teens, around 15 or 16. And I spoke, interestingly, with the person who was the program administrator at University of Toronto of the Museum Studies program way back when, and gained a lot of good insights from him, Robin Brion, if he's out there in the world still. And I think without that guidance, or at least without that start of the guidance, I don't think I would have been as successful in navigating my career.
Yeah, I think that's really important for art students, because I remember what made me decided to pursue the art industry is I work as an artist assistant after I graduated from high school, the summer after I graduated. So I feel like, oh, it's pretty interesting because I can't draw, but I love arts. I appreciate art. So I found that the art industry, the work in the art industry is pretty fascinating me. So I believe you heard a lot of doubts when you were in school too, studying art history. So you accomplished both bachelor and master degrees in art history, and there was no gap between the two. So what made you to keep pursuing the art history as a master degree?
Yeah, so again, this goes back to my meeting with Robin Brion when I was 16, 17 years old. He gave me two really wonderful pieces of advice, which was number one, volunteer and or do internships. Because certainly as a volunteer, when you're not getting paid, you can kind of control your destiny. And so if you go to smaller organizations and offer to volunteer, very often you'll have the opportunity to do much more than if you volunteer at a very large institution.
Exactly.
So large institutions, they have very set volunteer tasks. You might end up standing in a gallery, sort of helping to guard artwork, or you might end up at an info booth, providing, greeting visitors and providing them some direction. But at a smaller institution, very often you can leverage the fact that you're a volunteer to do more. So that was number one. And the other piece of advice that he said was that if you want to move into a position at some point like a curator, So a curator of exhibitions, a curator of collections, a curator of education and public programming. To have a graduate degree in that academic discipline is really very important.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't know what precisely I wanted to do. Like, I just knew that at age 16 or 17, I thought working in a museum sounds fascinating. And my career proves that it is fascinating in many of the ways I thought it would be, and many ways I could not have expected. But to have the master's degree really is important. And then I'll say at very large, like world-renowned institutions, you know, the Art Gallery of Ontario, where I used to work, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, almost all the curators have PhDs. So, so that's a very, you know, it's a long path to take. But if that is your vision, that should be the goal to, you know, the means to get there.
Mm-hmm. So one is volunteer and another one is your degree.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I know you've been dedicating around 20 years in education and public programs in the gallery setting. And you said you didn't know what you wanted to do when you were in school. But what made you realize at the end that public programming is what you want to do as a career? Did you know this role when you were in school?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'll say my track academically, you know, I aspired to be like the next great Italian Renaissance scholar, and then you go to the library at, you know, I attended York University, and there were like 2 entire you know, aisles of books that are dedicated to the Renaissance. And so then I thought, oh, well, so maybe I'll be the next 19th century French painting expert. And, you know, at the library, there's like 1 entire aisle of books that are dedicated to that. And so slowly it dawned on me that the place where I could, you know, potentially carve out, you know, a little bit of a niche, you know, continue to learn through my entire career, and perhaps, you know, make some kind of a little impact, maybe a big impact. The story's not over yet for me, but I thought contemporary art is the way to go, and so I focused on modern and contemporary. And then when it came to my professional activities, I did something that sounds very risky to a lot of people, but made a lot of sense to me at the time. When I was finishing my graduate program, in the late 90s, there were really no jobs here in Toronto. So, I mean, I was born and raised here in Toronto and attended York University. There were no jobs in the museum world. And of course, the internet was still at a very nascent stage. It was, you know, very what we like basic. And so there weren't a lot of websites. It was really hard to even find job listings, and there just weren't jobs. And by wonderful happenstance, I met someone who's actually on our webinar right now, in Omaha, Nebraska, and moved off. So my then partner, now husband Gary, and I moved off to Omaha, Nebraska, and I got a job. You know, like, what do graduate students know? I got a job at a bookstore for about a year-long period before I landed my first museum job. And as I tell everyone, any first job in a museum is a good job because it's a really competitive field. It's really competitive. And so I landed my first museum job as visitor and volunteer services coordinator at Joslyn Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. And from there, I had the opportunity, finally, as a museum professional, to really evaluate, what do museums do? Like, from the inside, I could see what museums do. What are the various roles and responsibilities? What are the various departments? How do they work with one another? And so this is why I say volunteering and doing an internship, if possible, are really, really important. But ultimately, the first job that you can land is the springboard into everything else. And so from there, I realized that I did have an interest in collections and in exhibitions, but that ultimately education and public programs really resonated with sort of my natural temperament.
So did you find your first job impact your choice later on that leads you to know what you want?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I had that, at that stage, an inside view of a museum. At the time, I don't know what Joslyn's staffing is now, but at the time the staffing was about 100 people, about 75 of whom were full-time and about 25 of whom were part-time. And so, there were very clearly articulated departments. My position happened to be in marketing and public relations, because visitor services is so forward-facing. And so I managed a staff at the front desks. We had 2 front desk entry areas. I managed all the volunteers, which during blockbuster periods skyrocketed from about 100 normally to about 500. And eventually I ended up also as the webmaster, managing the website from the aesthetic perspective, not the hardware, but what people actually saw on the website. And I also was involved in some of the fundraising. So from there, I realized what I didn't like to do. So I never wanted to be a webmaster again. That's not my thing. But I got a really good look at what the education department was doing, and I thought, that's really interesting. It would utilize my skills, and so that's sort of the direction I took.
Yeah, I feel like the very important thing for volunteering experience and an internship is you will have the chance to try it. So you know what you like and what you don't like. After you know what you dislike, the rest of it is the thing you need to explore and try.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's, really like anything we do, you take art classes, you take a painting class, you take a photography class, you take a ceramics class, which one do you like? So, your profession is kind of the same.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, I mean, it's really good and lucky that you know what you want at a really early stage, because some of the people out there, they don't know what they want, they don't know what they like, and they're confused. They always ask why I don't know what I want. But the first step is you put yourself out there and to try the different thing, then ended up like with a visual, like an idea of what you wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's never too late. So, I mean, I was an early sort of like, I identified early on this interest, but it's never too late. But no matter at what stage you may be, there is, I would say sort of tried and true advice is volunteer, get an internship, take a part-time position, even if it is, sitting at an info booth or something, because all of a sudden that gives you that inside perspective on how these institutions work.
So after your first job, have you started to work as a curator of public programming since then?
Yeah, so after my role in Omaha at Joslyn Art Museum, I realized that I really wanted to shift into education, and of course, any future decision making wasn't mine alone. So I mean, at that stage, I was now in a relationship. So so the agreement that my husband and I reached was that I could look around and he could veto any place that he really, really objected to. But I ended up finding a position at a relatively small museum at Utah State University in northern Utah, in Logan, Utah, called the Nora, Eccles Harrison Museum of Art, where I was the curator of education. And the positive thing about that experience is, though as a volunteer during my university years, I had opportunity to work on some small exhibits that were of a more historical nature. All of a sudden, I had the opportunity to not only develop public programs for college students and up, but also work on programs for school age, sort of like K through 12 students, and also contribute to some exhibition research and even developing some small exhibitions. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, it's sort of like I started shifting much more into that direction of education and public programs, but even still had the opportunity to do things sort of like beyond just education and public programs.
So how would you describe a typical week in your role? Let's say before the exhibition or after the exhibition that's launched.
Wow. Yeah, I'll say, so I feel like every week has something of the looking back and looking forward. So I'm always sort of trapped between the looking back and looking forward. So we create programs, and so in an average week, a typical week, I will be reaching out to potential presenters, or I'll be working with any of my direct reports. So I have 4 people who work with me. The Visitor and Volunteer Services Coordinator, the TD Curator of Education and Outreach Fellow, which is a 2-year position for a recent graduate who's interested in, you know, professionalizing their education and public programming practice, the Power Kids and Outreach Coordinator, and a Power Youth Coordinator. So in a typical week, I may be reaching out to potential presenters, but any of my direct reports may be also, like on my behalf, on the behalf of the power plant, reaching out to potential presenters. And so in that way, we cobble together a season's worth of programming. Of course, we're always working toward a print deadline. So print deadlines are your best friend, because that really forces you to sort of create the timeline and work toward that timeline. So like right now, end of August is like, that will be our fall 2020 program guide deadline for like everything must be absolutely done, confirmed. And so right now is the scramble to think about the exhibitions that we've learned about from the curators of these exhibitions. So we'll have 3 exhibitions opening at the very end of September. And so my colleagues and I, in conversation with the curators, in conversation with the artists, and in conversation with ourselves, come up with public programs. So, so the typical week is lots of email, lots of meetings, lots of telephone calls, and just enough time in between all of that to think and process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can tell your professionalism from your email, because it's just so compact and so clear in one email about what you wanted to ask, what you wanted to coordinate.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
So is research a large aspect of your work? If so, and where and how do you collect the research that informs your work and programming?
Yeah, so so in my role as Curator of Education and Public Programs, a lot of the material with which I work comes to me from the curators of exhibitions and or the artists themselves. And so so my colleagues who are organizing the exhibitions They'll do presentations. We have bi-weekly, so meetings every other week of the curatorial team. And at the power plant, curatorial, you know, in quotes, includes both exhibitions and education. So we are in constant dialogue. So we're constantly learning about the exhibitions that are coming up. But then we'll say parallel to that, my direct reports and we are doing our own reading and our own research. So we're scouring the internet for information about these artists. Where else have they exhibited? What are their big themes? Have there been any interviews with them? Interviews are always a really good source. But then we're also thinking back to what I refer to as like the menu of public programs, the possible types of public programs we can offer. So we always, for example, have an artist do either an artist talk or a conversation. And even the conversation starts off with something of a shorter artist talk. We have a long-standing series called Sunday Scene, which are gallery talks by artists, curators, and experts from other fields, all located here in Toronto. And so they give us a more local perspective on artists who may be Canadian, but maybe from elsewhere around the world. And so this menu includes things like literary programs and films and musical programs and so on and so on. And then of course, we have parallel to our public programs, if we say for college age and up, we also have programs for children and for youth. And so all of that is sort of running parallel.
So what would you say is the most important component of developing programs for a diverse audience?
Well, for starters, it's acknowledging that the city of Toronto and Canada as a nation are incredibly diverse. So it's like, once you have that in your mind, all of a sudden you can really start to see the possibilities. I think the flip side of that is to say that even though these artists are coming from Canada and around the world, we as human beings have a lot of the same shared wants and desires and dreams and goals. We may have different perspectives, politically, theologically, philosophically, but I think there are ways of tapping into what could be described as more universal. We'll say, like a majority of people have a particular mindset, but also then recognizing that we are, after all individuals. So when it comes to something, I'll say like a film or a film series, trying to talk about diversity, we'll ask each artist, do they have a film in particular that they feel, you know, relates to their work? And so when the decisions aren't all coming out of like Josh Heuman's head, all of a sudden that creates diversity.
So what's the difference you notice about the gallery education or, let's say, public programming today than a few years ago?
Well, so I'll say right now in this like time of COVID-19, so literally over that weekend in like mid-March, from March 13th to March 16th, when the city went into lockdown mode, we literally suspended operations on site. So the power plant closed at the end of the day on March 16th. And everything we had planned was sort of, we'll say, temporarily postponed until we could figure out what could we do? What other programming could we do? And so I'll say the timing was sort of, you know, convenient, because the month of April is National Poetry Month. And so in my past, so this is like the value of experience. In my past, I developed as a partnership living elsewhere in Houston, Texas, an ekphrastic poetry competition. So poetry written about works of art. And so within a matter of a week, we pulled together in partnership with the Toronto International Festival of Authors and with Toronto's poet laureate, Al Moritz, we pulled together an ekphrastic poetry competition that we were doing online. And we began to think about a symposium that we were going to have literally the next week, like after the closure. We were going to have this symposium featuring 4 scholars from, all beyond Toronto and some moderators. And we thought, oh, well, let's take that and split it up into 4 Zoom programs. And so we pushed the dates, pushed it back later than it would have been, but divided it up into 4 separate programs that created, we'll call it a symposium series. And so we've been very reactionary during this period. I'll say before this period, and now looking forward to the fall, we could be a little bit more deliberate, a little bit less reactionary and more proactive. I think the biggest differences are that probably like in the last 3, 4, 5 years is that there is much greater emphasis in museums across the board, art, science, history, and so on, in diversity and inclusion. Really making sure that the museum is not sort of like a cultural custodian of the colonial project, as much as it is responsive to what is relevant to local, national, or even global audiences. And so the thinking is no longer simply that, a particular person from a particular class, a particular geographic region of origin, and so on, gets to determine what is of interest to everyone. Right, and so it is about that plurality of perspectives.
Do you think that people are starting to pay more attention to our education nowadays?
In what sense?
So like, let's say people are eager to learn more about art and they go to exhibition more often. They want to know more about what's going on in the art world.
That's a complicated question for me to answer, because I consider myself to be like a lifelong learner of art. The power plant is incredibly democratic. So with being very fortunate recipients of support from BMO, Bank of Montreal, for our all year, all free admission policy, literally anytime we are open to the public, we are open to everyone. And so we have, I'll say, a wonderful base of artists in Toronto. Toronto has an estimated 25,000 self-described artists. So we have artists who come, we have other fellow cultural workers come, so curators from other institutions, or employees at other cultural institutions. And then we have, I'll say the general public. And during the summertime, it may be, because we're right there along the lake, at Harbourfront Centre, we're along Lake Ontario, so people are strolling along the boardwalk. Some people pop in because they're in search of a restroom or air conditioning, but somehow we manage to pull them into take a look around. You're here, it's free. We have these fantastic exhibitions by these artists from all around the world. take a look. And so very often we'll have just that wonderful sort of opportunity to see the light bulb go on for someone, that they sort of connect with something in a very visceral way, and unexpectedly.
Yeah.
So.
And for those interested in getting started in the field, like for who one day hope to be a curator of education and public programs, what would you suggest to them in terms of building experience or skills?
Yeah, so I'll say specific to education and public programs. So I've jokingly said I have no business doing what I do professionally because I've never, ever taken an education course in any way, shape, or form. So what I have done, though, is spend a lot of time attending public programs, and trying to attend programs of different types. So, the minute I hear about some program that's in a format that I'm not familiar with, not just a lecture or a panel discussion or a film screening, but something more innovative, I'll try to get there to watch it, because, we learn by stealing, I'll say borrowing, other people's methods. I've read extensively about educational pedagogy. So all different approaches. If you think of Loritz Malaguzzi, the Reggio Emilia method. I've read about Maria Montessori, the Montessori method, and a lot of constructivist education pedagogy. And so I think sort of having an awareness of how people learn, and and then just having that actual real world exposure of going to public programs to see how other people are doing it are fundamental. And then I'll say, there is sort of that academics. So you do kind of have to know the subject area. So if you're, looking to work with contemporary art, like read a lot about contemporary art, go and see a lot of contemporary art, write about it. There are all sorts of opportunities to interview artists, to write essays, to present at academic conferences, speak to gallerists, speak to museum staff. So it's like all of this goes into, feeding a potential career.
Great. So do most of your career experience follow the regular path as a apply, interview, offer, or is there any interesting way that you got the job?
Yeah, so I'll say I often hear people say that getting a job is all about networking. I am the exact opposite, in the sense that my very first job in a museum, I became aware of that job from someone that I was like in my circle, but I had no connection to that museum. I had never met anyone at that museum. So my application is what I would call a cold application. I sent a cover letter and a resume, and whatever it was, a few weeks later, I got a phone call and we booked an interview. So the first interview was with one person who ended up to be my boss. And after that interview, I was told that there would be one more interview to come, that, she was interviewing several people on her own, and that then there would be like a group interview. And so a couple of weeks later, I was invited back for a second interview, not only with her, but also the director of the museum and the deputy director of the museum. And the reason is that that position, visitor and volunteer services coordinator, was for Joslyn Art Museum a brand new position. They had never had that position before. And so they kind of wanted to make sure that internally they knew what the position was, and, and also that the person they were going to hire into that position had the broad range of skills they were looking for. And then I'll say the other jobs that I have had, so Logan, Utah, at the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art, the Salt Lake Art Center in Salt Lake City, Utah, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and now the power plant. Again, I had no connections with anyone at those institutions. So I saw job listings, I put together my cover letter and my resume and submitted it. I'll say at in Logan, and actually in all four of those instances, there was an interview, but there was also some additional component, whether it was a written component and or a presentation component to getting those jobs.
So what are the keys that the art professionals are looking for when they are recruiting as interns for new positions? Are they looking more on degree, experience, or their skills?
So the disheartening answer is all of the above. I'll say our TD Curator of Education and Outreach Fellow is a great example, because that's what I would consider to be more robust even than an internship, because it is a 2-year position. We are seeking someone who has a graduate degree. We are seeking someone who has some kind of experience, demonstrated experience of involvement in not only an art museum context, but ideally in developing or running some kind of a public program, you know, even if it was like once, even if it was a smaller program, but just that they come in with an awareness of the fact that there is a process involved in developing programs. And then really we hit the ground running. Their first 6 months is simply learning from me how public programs actually come into being. So we spend a lot of time talking. So I'll say backing up to something like being a volunteer or an intern, you know, the requirements are lower. So we're not necessarily looking for, like when I have taken on interns, which is not a constant, it's like sort of when I can, because managing people takes a lot of time. So when I can take a volunteer or an intern in education and public programs specifically, you know, someone with a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, someone who's really curious about education public programs, someone who's interested in like archives and research. Ultimately, we do have a lot of volunteer opportunities at the power plant, and even in sort of education public programming. But the bigger, broader opportunities are, you know, helping out with our Power Kids program, or helping out with our Power Youth program, which takes place off-site. But direct involvement in sort of organizing education and public programs is not a very frequent sort of volunteer/intern opportunity, because I really need someone who will be around for 8 months or a year. Like a lot of programs take a long time to plan.
Great. So I covered all the questions I have for you, and now we have another 20 minutes to answer all the questions from the audience.
Right.
We'll answer the few questions from the email that we received. The first one is, has your work or your role been impacted because of the pandemic? Where do you think organizations like the Power Plant are heading in terms of programming, development, and accessibility?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I sort of addressed the COVID a bit in the sense that we took we took from our winter season, which was suspended because of this pandemic, and thought, what can we reformat? Not simply as we're going to take this program and do it online, but how could we capitalize on the fact that we were doing it online? And how would that be different than doing it in person? So that's sort of like responsiveness to the COVID. When it comes to the future of programming, certainly the sort of shifting some of the programming online has given us this insight that we could do programs on site, but also have an online component. So I think moving forward, we are certainly going to try our best to do, like, even if we're having an on-site program, to have some kind of online component to it, whether that's a live broadcast of it or potentially or just a recording of it. So we'll sort of have to play that by ear. The number of staff is not changing. It's not like we're hiring someone who's going to be our, you know, like, here is the way to make things all online person. So it will really still depend on the current staffing level to figure out how to do that. And then I'll say accessibility, I want to address very specifically. We're very pleased to be recipients of an Ontario Trillium Foundation seed grant. So it's a 1-year grant. It was intended to be for calendar year 2020 from January to December, but we've been given an extension into 2021 specific to accessibility. So what does that mean? So we had and will continue to do audio recordings of our wall signage and put that on SoundCloud, and that will be linked from our exhibition pages. We'll have ASL interpreters at select public programs. Each season, we do an audio description tour for visitors who are blind or partially sighted. And then we take the audio of that audio description tour and have an ASL tour about 3 weeks or a month later for visitors who are deaf, deafened, or partial hearing. And then the other component of this grant, so like the power plant never does anything small. So the second part of it is doing workshops, hands-on art making workshops with 3 partner organizations, CAMH, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, Camp Uchigeas, which is a camp for children and youth with cancer and immune deficiency disorders, and the March of Dimes, which works with adults with physical disabilities. So, so this is certainly, it's new to us, but something that we intend to carry forward.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Another question is a fellowship a good starting point after graduate school? If yes, and why?
Yeah, so I'll say, you know, I'll call it, I mean, this may be a politically incorrect term, the holy grail is to land a fellowship. So at the power plant, we are incredibly fortunate to have 2 fellowship positions. One is supported by TD, the TD Curator of Education and Outreach Fellow, who works directly with me on developing a huge range of public programs over a 2-year period. And we also have another position in exhibitions, the Nancy McCain and Bill Morneau Curatorial Fellow, who comes in from that exhibitions side and works on exhibitions. And that is, you know, it's like a 2-year boot camp. So you could come with all the academic experience possible, but it is an intense 2 years. I will like put my stamp on it, my guarantee that this is like doing a master's degree in how to plan public programs. Of course, the sad reality is we only have one of these positions, and because it is a 2-year position, it's you know, there's a gap. It's incredibly competitive, but I am aware that other institutions around the country and elsewhere around the world have fellowships, so internships and fellowships, and I strongly encourage people to go after them. The irony, of course, is that in my career, I have had interns, I have had fellows. At the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, I ran a very robust internship and fellowship program among my various responsibilities. But personally, I never had an internship or fellowship. The opportunities just weren't there 20, 25 years ago. So this is a relatively, I would say, a relatively new phenomenon, like just that has come about in the last 10 years or so.
I think I've heard a lot about the internship, but not the fellowship.
Right.
Another question is, are you running fellowships for 2020 or 2021? And how do we find more information about this?
Yeah, so any position at the power plant will be on our website under the About Us. There should be like an opportunities or jobs, something like a link. But also we distribute word everywhere. So it ends up on, you know, Work in Culture and the Ontario Association of Art Galleries website and the Ontario Museum Association website, and we send it directly to all the different universities and colleges. Yeah, so it'll be out there. I'll say 2021. I think the summer of 2021 should be the start of our next fellowships. So odds are we'll be putting out word sometime in the winter of 2021.
So how much you value the applicants with other humanities background, not art history?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one, because the power plant is so specific to contemporary art. And while certainly I want a fellow who's interested in education and public programs to be working with me, I don't have time to teach them art history and how to do education and public programs. So I definitely need someone who is coming with that art history background. And it sounds ironic to say, well, we work with contemporary art, living artists, so why do you need this art history background? Well, it's because artists now are creating work that not only responds to our current times, but is also part of a very long evolution. And I won't say it's a linear evolution, because like that's sort of the old school modernist idea that one movement followed the next, followed the next, followed the next. We recognize artists are working from all around the world with different traditions. And so it's really important to just have that grounding in what was, in order to talk about what is and what might be in the future.
So another question is, how should someone go about choosing their education, let's say programs and specializations, to pursue a career in museums and public programming?
That's a really great question. I'll say, like, what resonates with you is the most important thing. If it excites and interests you, you will excel in it. Pardon me. And so I know there's sort of like, there's wisdom out there that says, like, look for the blind spots, look for the areas that are not yet occupied. The problem is that those blind spots are constantly moving. So study what interests you, and you will do well in it. And by doing well in it, that will open doors. So if you're really, really interested, you know, I think back again to my story, if I really, really wanted to do Italian Renaissance studies, then I would have done that, and I would have excelled in it as much as I could. And so hopefully that would have opened doors.
Mm-hmm.
Inside, somehow I knew that that just wasn't, you know, it just didn't excite me quite enough. And so, right, I looked for the next thing. And eventually modern and contemporary just struck me as like, this is the thing. This is the thing that really excites me. Because for me, contemporary art is art history in the making. Mm-hmm. We are hopefully, the choices that the power plant makes are artists who will end up in the art history survey books in 250 years, right? So
another question is, what is the role of grants and grant writing in public programs and education? Is grant writing a big part of your job?
Very big part of my job. So the power plant is fortunate. We do have a full-time grants and sponsorship officer. Shout out to Emily out there if she's out there. So we are fortunate that we have a full-time grant writer. However, the grant writer handles a lot of details of the grant, but some portions really have to come from content specialists. Mm-hmm. So if we're doing a grant for an exhibition and its complementary public programs, or if we're doing a grant specific to education and public programs, I am very often involved in helping to craft the narrative, so the description of the project itself, what we can do. So like when it came to this expanding access grant, as an example, you know, how many of these programs could we actually do in a year-long period? Like what's realistic? And then how much is all that going to cost? So I'm involved in the narrative and the budget components for a lot of grants. And then what a lot of people don't think about with grants is that once you've submitted it and you've gotten it, then there's all sorts of reporting. So it's keeping track of attendance, making note of any sort of like testimonials, any kind of evaluation that you have been able to do with participants, with partners. And then what have you learned from this process? Because a lot of grants want to know that not only are they supporting this public component, but that they're also supporting the institution to learn more and to develop better strategies.
Yeah.
So I'll mention just very briefly, grant writing is not really a thing that you learn in university. At least I don't know of any university that has a course in grant writing, but there are a lot of institutions, organizations around the city that do offer workshops in grant writing. Yeah, so if you can, and some of them are free. So that's right. So some of these workshops are free. So sign up for a workshop.
Yeah, great. And would you say that the desired education in the field is a master's degree, or will other postgraduate programs in art education help someone qualify for a role in public programming?
Yeah, so I mean, so I can only speak sort of like from my experience. So I'll say smaller organizations typically do not require advanced degrees, or certainly don't require a PhD. Mm-hmm. So like at the power plant, I have a master's degree, and I feel like I have come with all the right experience needed. And I'll say, fortunately, my boss, Gaetan Verna, our director, agrees. But at very large institutions, you know, the AGO, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Vancouver Art Gallery, these are institutions where they are certainly looking for a master's degree, like to be the head of education, a master's degree, or even a PhD. And I'll say that the PhD in some cases could be sort of like the subject of the museum. So at an art museum, art history; at a history museum, a history degree, and so on. But also, degrees in education are always helpful. I'll say I've pondered doing a degree in education, but I haven't pursued that, yet. I may or may not.
Great. And the last question is blogging about contemporary art a good experience?
Blogging about contemporary art. So I'd say blogging about contemporary art, it's sort of like, to me, as someone, let's say I'm interviewing someone and they have experience blogging, I would want to look at the blog, but I would say, that certainly it demonstrates the ability to write, to think critically about art, presuming that you're writing about art, that there's an awareness of, if it's focused on contemporary art, that there's an awareness of contemporary art and the discourses that surround contemporary arts more specifically than, the discourses that, surround more historical artwork. So I think, blogging is certainly a great, a great demonstration of writing skill. So it would check like one box for me.
Yeah, because right now there are a lot of art influencers on social media as well. And Davis Warner, I think they hire an art influencer as their online sales. Do you think that's a big change for the art market right now, as a art industry, art influencers on social media?
Yeah, I'll say yes and no. So I mean, a lot depends. Like there is definitely a difference between the nonprofit world and the commercial aspect of art. So, commercial galleries and nonprofit art spaces have different goals, different stakeholders, different audiences. And so as a result, they have different strategies. At the power plant, we have 2 people who work in marketing and communications. We have a manager whose responsibility is predominantly placing ads, doing press releases, a lot of sort of print projects, but also electronic, media. And then we have a marketing and communications assistant who focuses, I'll say, more on social media, not exclusively, so it's sort of like a shared responsibility, but who focuses a bit more on social media. And so social media is certainly, I'll say a tool that has arisen over the last 10 years. Each platform has its strengths and weaknesses, and different strategies for creating content. Some like Instagram are much more image heavy. Some like Facebook are, have, I'll say, maybe more text heavy. It's always good to have like a really striking image, but ultimately there's more capacity for text. But I'll say the marketing and communication side is something that obviously it complements anything going on at a place like the power plant. But when it comes to me and my colleagues in education and public programming, our sort of form of promotion is usually emailing directly to professors, to student groups, to principals at schools, to peers at other institutions, to say, hey, we're doing this program. We think you and or your constituents might be interested. So, so from my perspective, like in education and public programs, the fact that I may use social media in my personal life is not part of my professional life.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Yeah. Thanks for your talk. So if there are no more questions, it's the end of the talk. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. If you have more questions that you want to discuss with Josh, and you could email him. And I believe you all received the email from the the contact information in the email.
Yeah,
So,
but just in case, my email address is the letter J, my last name, Heuman, at thepowerplant.org. So feel free to email me with any questions. I promise response within about 48 hours.
great. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and stay tuned on our next event on August 7th with Justine, who is the Assistant Curator of Exhibitions at the Power Plant. Thanks everyone.
Awesome. Thank you and have a great day.